Hey, thank you, Marty. Well, good morning, everyone. Karen Schaefer here, Chair of the Council of Metropolitan Area Leagues, CMAL, welcoming you to a very exciting program that we have on protecting the metropolitan area water supply. I want to thank in particular the League of Women Voters, Woodbury Cottage Grove area for co-sponsoring this event and helping publicize it. And thank Lynn Marcus in particular for working with CMAL to conceive of and design the program. Her help was invaluable. And I want to thank Marty Mix for hosting our meeting. She's an excellent Zoom host, and I thank her for that. We've got two great speakers today, and I think what we should do, what is sort of typical for these meetings, if people would enter their questions into the chat box, I will monitor the chat box and bring the questions forward, either after each speaker or after both are done. We have until 11:30 if we wish, but as many of you know, these Zoom meetings can be ruthlessly efficient. Nobody has to spend any time walking up to the microphone to ask questions. And so sometimes we get through even within an hour or so, but we do have till 11:30. So I would like to introduce our first speaker, and she is Lanya Ross, and she is a water supply planner and analyst at the Metropolitan Council. Her background is in geology, which is an apt background for water supply. And she has been doing water supply analysis and other types of environmental work for over 20 years, which I think means she started when she was 8 years old. And she has been at the Metropolitan Council. Lanya, I don't know how many years you've been there, but you've been working with our 180 communities and other and utilities to do water supply planning, policy development, and groundwater modeling, which are great services. And we have asked you, and you have said that you will give us some basic information on the sources of our water, the uses to which it is put, the demand for it, and something that Lynn and I were kind of interested in, I must say, the pricing of water, how it is priced to the consumers. So I think Marty has made you a host. Lanya, would you like to start your presentation?
Thank you very much for the invitation to be here today. And I am excited to share a little bit of my work. I've been working at the Metropolitan Council for 14 years. Before that, I was with the Shakopee Mdewakanton Sioux community. And it's a topic I love, so I'm trying to keep it short and concise. Bear with me here as I share my screen. Quick question. Do you guys see the full screen presentation? All right, I'm seeing a thumbs up.
I do see it, yes.
Fantastic. All right, so I was asked to set the water table, and I very much appreciated that title suggestion. So I'm going to go through fairly quickly because I'd like to leave time for questions. I have embedded several links throughout this presentation, and I did share with Marty a PDF version of this. So if anybody would like a copy later, I'm happy to share that.
Lanya, real quick question. Are you intending to have us see the next slide? Because that's what we're seeing, the primary slide and the next slide.
Oh, fantastic. Let me do a quick redo. I do a lot of work in Microsoft Teams and in WebEx. Zoom is new territory for me. Is that a little bit better, easier to see? I'm seeing the full screen.
We have full screen.
Full screen. Now, here's the trick. I've lost my notes, so now I'm winging it. Bear with me here. But I wanted to start by acknowledging that water shapes all of our lives every single day, winter, spring, summer, and fall. So when we talk about water supply, I think we go to drinking water, but really water supply is everything that supports our lives, from ice fishing and the lakes in the western part of the metro. Oh, I'm getting it frozen. You get to really stare at this ice fishing pattern here. To the summer farming that we see in the dry, sandy soils of the southeastern metro in Dakota County. And as we think about the landscape of the metro area, we have very urban parts of our region, but we also have 50% of ag or undeveloped land. And so water has a different role to play across this big region. We use it to move our commodities. So water supply is part of our economy and our transit system. And of course, we use it to play. It is part of our boating culture, our water culture, our lakes, our beaches, our parks. We take water out of the river and out of the ground to treat and drink. And this is the Minneapolis water treatment plant. And then, of course, we use it in our houses. We put it on our lawns. We use it in our businesses. And then we treat it again and put it back into the rivers. Our goal is to put it back better than we found it. And this is an aerial photo of the Metro plant. And you can see the discharge of our treated clean water going back into the river. So this is, when I think about water supply, there's a lot of facets to it. Currently, our water supply is supporting about 3 million people. That's our estimate of the population in 2020, and about 1.7 million jobs. And we are expected to grow and use more. So our recent forecasts suggest that we are expecting 4 million people in 2050. And so if we continue to use water in the future, the way that we're using it now, which is about 100 gallons per person per day, we may expect to use 100 million gallons in 2050. That's a big increase. And so if you'd like to learn more about the long range forecasts, not just the total amount we're expecting to see, but also some of those demographic shifts, I did include a link here in the slide. But there is some indication that we may be using water a little bit differently. So I just wanted to give you a historical look at water use in the metro area. This graph is illustrating water use from 1980 to 2019. And so the total amount of water that we've used, this is for the municipal public water suppliers. So this does not include the private wells, but that's the bulk of our water use. You can see that total water use, the darkest blue, increased through the 2010s and then decreased somewhat. And there's many factors that could be contributing to this. We had the Great Recession, so there was a slowdown in development and thus a slowdown in new sod, some of that water using development. We become more efficient. Our water appliances have become more efficient. And I think there's just been a growing awareness of water efficiency as a regional goal. But if you want to think about it a little bit differently too, you can look at the difference in water use over time in just the groundwater sources used by many of our suburbs. So that's the medium blue line. That too increased through the 2010s and then decreased. The lightest blue color is the surface water use in the metropolitan area. So Minneapolis, St. Paul, and the communities that they provide water to. And you can see that use increased through the into the 90s, but then has slowly been decreasing, and that's a reflection of increased density, smaller yards, less irrigation, just some different patterns. More apartment buildings, that kind of.
Say, Lanya,
Yeah.
on the previous slide, you had a circle graph.
Which slide are we on?
Maybe one back. Oops. Most of the water usage here, this one was public water systems. Would you explain what that blue section means?
Yep. So when we look at the Department of Natural Resource database, anybody who uses more than 10,000 gallons a day or 1 million gallons a year has to report their water use to the Department of Natural Resources. So when we look at all of that water use, we see that in the metropolitan area, most of the water is used by public water systems. So those would be your city water suppliers. There's a fairly significant but smaller chunk that's used for irrigation. So that might be those irrigation wells. There's several of those in Dakota County. It may be irrigation wells used for golf courses would be another use. They're private wells, but they have that purpose. Special categories in water level maintenance might be a construction site where they're dewatering during construction. Industrial processing would be some of those industrial uses. 3M, Cargill, Land O'Lakes. I mean, they use water in their businesses. And then we did do an estimate of the private domestic water use. So those would be all of those private wells that we see in our rural areas. So just to give you a sense of the breakout in water use. And this is also one of the reasons why at the Metropolitan Council, our water supply planning work focuses so heavily on working with the municipal suppliers, because they are such a large component of the water use. We do also have some other programs that do target industry and irrigation, but it's a smaller, more focused piece of our work. Did that kind of help?
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I'm going to flip back through slides. I apologize if there is a lag. I know sometimes there's a delay. This is the graph I was talking about water use over time. Does everybody see that one again?
Mm-hmm.
All right. So water use has changed over time. It's generally been increasing, but recently we're starting to see a slight decrease. And I think that that's partly climate. We've had some really wet years in the past decade in particular. Also changes in more efficient devices and appliances. And maybe some slowdown in the economy and some shifts in development patterns. So there's a bunch of facets here. But one piece that I wanted to make sure I shared with everybody was the seasonal patterns of our water use over time. And so this is kind of a complicated graph. I put it here for you. I hope you can go back and think about it more later. But this is the trend in summer versus winter water use from 1980 to 2019. So I'll just try to walk you through what is shown here. And if you have questions, I would welcome them. But this is the ratio between summer versus winter. So if the ratio was 1, that would mean we're using exactly the same amount of water in the summer that we do in the winter. If the ratio is 2, that means that we're using twice as much water in the summer as we do in the winter. So where you see the values up on the top part of this graph, that means that we're using much more water in the summertime compared to what we do in the winter. So the gray line on this graph is the combined. It's all the water from the municipal water suppliers, be they groundwater supplied or surface water supplied. So it's kind of a metro average. And so you can see that it started out in the 1980s around 1.8, 1.6. In 88, it went up to a little over 2 as a region. So in 1988, we're using twice as much water in the summer as we did in the winter. And for those of you who recall, there was some pretty strong drought conditions then.
Mm-hmm.
In the more recent years, we're hovering in that 1.8, and in 2007, we were up to 2.6, getting close to 3. So there's been a slight increase in the amount of water we use in the summer versus the amount of water we use in the winter. And there's two facets for that. One, we're either putting more water on our lawns or doing more things with our water outside. Alternatively, we may be more efficient during the winter with that indoor water use. So we're reducing the amount of water we're using in the winter because we installed more efficient washing machines and dishwashers and low flow aerators and more efficient toilets. So there's some shifts both in the summer and in the winter. One thing I find very interesting about this graph is that if you look at the communities, the water use that draws from groundwater sources, that's the line in blue. You see that people who are using groundwater, communities who are using groundwater, tend to use more water in the summer versus the amount of water they use in the winter, compared to communities who are using surface water as a source. That's the line in green. So again, the surface water communities are Minneapolis, St. Paul, and the communities that they provide water to. So more of that urban core, denser, older development. So there's some different water use patterns that reflect some of the different land use and development patterns in the metro. And this somewhat, for the groundwater users, there's this sort of slight increase in summer versus winter water demand over time is one of the reasons why we have been focusing on some water efficiency programs at the Metropolitan Council and turf grass research in particular, which I'll talk about in a little while. But I think, just looking at water use is very simple. And when you dig down and start to look at it in some different ways, I think we start to see some interesting patterns that express how our community uses water. So we're pulling all that water, like I mentioned, from several different sources. We actually, I think of us as having 7. We have stormwater and wastewater, which we can reuse in certain non-potable purposes. We also have surface water, the Mississippi River, which we pull from to drink, but we also have the Minnesota and the St. Croix for other uses. Power supply on the St. Croix is one example. And then we have 4 major aquifers. So we're very water rich here, but all of these sources do have a variety of considerations. They're not all equally accessible. Seasonal and climate variability can affect how available they are, or can affect recharge into our aquifers, for example. We have a lot of different uses, and in some cases they can compete with one another. There's vulnerability to contamination that we need to consider. And then there are also regulatory and funding challenges, which vary from source to source and across the metro. The other component that I wanted to bring attention to was just to highlight that our water supply is associated with big infrastructure. So there's the source, the water, but there's also how do we move it around and how do we get it from its source to us. We have over 100 municipal water supply systems here in the metro area, and we have over 60,000 private wells currently. Wow. And our communities are planning very significant investments going into the future. So we have dozens of communities planning to install or rehabilitate wells, maintain and install new distribution systems, storage, and enhance our treatment. And so if you want to get a sense of the cost of some of these investments, I did include a link to the 2021 Public Facilities Authority report on estimated needs. And that is just a snapshot of the requests through that fund, but it does give you a sense. When we're talking about municipal wells, it can be $100,000 depending on the details of the wells. Hundreds of thousands of dollars for distribution system maintenance and new storage, millions of dollars for system-wide water main rehab or new treatment. So this is incredibly large regional investment. And I think sometimes because it is managed at the local level, it's not a regional system. We don't always think about the magnitude of this infrastructure as supporting our region. I mean, I also want to not downplay the cost of these private wells. On average, nationally, this is super rough, a private well, domestic well, costs $9,000 to install, and that doesn't include the maintenance. So this past summer, where we had an extreme drought, there was a big problem with wells going dry and the need to either put in a new well or to deepen wells, and that comes with a cost as well. So this is important for us to keep in mind. For the cities, those costs are supported by our water rates. And this is my favorite description of what water rates cover. This is from the city of Lakeville. So our rates, the rates that we pay, are used to cover the cost incurred by the city for providing the utility service. The rates cover the cost of operating the water system, so water treatment, water meter replacements, well rehabilitation. They also pay for construction costs for replacing or upgrading aging utilities infrastructure and related debt payments. And I give a gold star to anybody who notices that water rates do not pay for the water itself. It's the service to provide it and make sure it's safe and adequate. I don't have a summary of water rate data in this presentation because it's very widespread and complex, but we do have a tool on the Metropolitan Council website where you can compare water rates among communities across the metro. So I would encourage you to check that out. And we also created a report in 2016, which analyzes the water billing for communities in the Twin Cities metropolitan area, looks at some of the trends, kind of thinking and providing some information to inform how we might construct water rates that support water conservation. Do our current rates do that? What are some examples? So that's, I think, a very good report that I would encourage you to explore.
So Lanya, could I ask a question? Is there anything in the Metropolitan Council policy or whatever tools you have that has the intent of moving people from private wells onto municipal systems, or is that just something that's left up to each community?
That is something that is left up to each community. Thank you for raising that question. Water supply, in all of our development of water policy at the Metropolitan Council, we've heard over and over again that water supply is the responsibility and of the local community and local water supply system. Communities have the opportunity, should they choose, to enact ordinances that would limit the installation of new wells within their community or within their municipal water supply service area. There's, I've heard opinions on both sides of that. We are beginning at the Metropolitan Council to think about the update of our regional policies and our system plans. We have the census came out, which kind of kicks off the regional plan update process. The question of rural policy and acknowledging some of the challenges for wastewater treatment and water supply has been a topic that's raised. These are early conversations, but there's been some good research recently. Dakota County comes to mind in particular, looking at some of the water quality challenges that private well owners face. In some parts of the metropolitan area, we have increased nitrate levels. In other parts of the metropolitan area, there's naturally occurring manganese or radium. So that question of providing safe, adequate water in rural areas not served by municipal water supplies is a question that I have, and I'm hoping that your point, like you just did, that we raise that and it becomes part of the conversation as we update these regional policies. That was kind of a wishy-washy answer. I apologize.
So could one other follow-up? So there is a statute, isn't there, that encourages municipalities to do their water billing in a way that encourages conservation. Did you say that the Metropolitan Council is currently studying whether that's really happening or not? I didn't quite catch that.
Yes, so there is a statute and the wording in it has changed. I don't remember off the top of my head what the current wording is. It's related to the statute that sets some of the expectations for local water supply planning and related to the Department of Natural Resources. But yes, that cities should have a water conservation rate. There's been some shifts to that language because, you know, what defines a water conservation rate was kind of not clearly defined. So that's evolved over time. And there was also some recognition that the rate is not the only tool that communities have to promote water conservation. There's also some other programs that they could be implementing outside of rates that could achieve the same goal. So, but yes, the idea of using rates and other tools that communities can use to promote water conservation is definitely there and a goal. The study we did in 2016 explored a little bit of that to say, what are the rates of the metropolitan area? One of the questions we asked is, do these rates actually promote water conservation or not? And in some cases, we see that that might be the case. In some cases, it's not as clear. But this is a good study to look at and see. As far as I know, well, I'm very familiar with it because it's our study, but it's the only one that I've come across that really explicitly asked that question.
We could go look at the study and then look for all of our individual communities. We can see what the conclusion was.
Yes, and we didn't, you know what? Yes, rates have changed in a couple of communities because it was a 2016 report. So the most current rates are on our water comparison tool. But yes, I think this is a very good starting point. And it sounds like if you're interested in some of those rates, there's going to be some very good information to spark some thinking and conversation around that. And you got me all excited now. I'm thinking about new projects we can do. Well, shifting gears a little bit because infrastructure and rates are very important. Working at the Metropolitan Council, I'm also very interested in some of the land use controls, particularly as it relates to source water protection and the minimizing risk of contamination. So I did want to share this map with you. 1,500 square miles in the metropolitan area have been designated as source water protection areas by the Department of Health and the community water suppliers. So just to give you a sense of where those areas are, you can see here the gray area is the watershed that contributes to Minneapolis and St. Paul intakes on the Mississippi River. So it's the watershed upstream of those intakes. So that's the area in our metro that, you know, is most likely to contribute to water quality where we're pulling water from the river. The blue areas are those areas that contribute to the groundwater supplied water systems. So these are areas kind of that pull water toward our public wells. And some of these areas overlap with one another. So one area actually contributes water to multiple communities. So the blue areas are actually shaded by how many people that area provides water to. So the darker the blue, the more people. And you can see that the darkest blue here in sort of the central part of the metropolitan area, that contributes water to St. Paul, their communities that they supply, as well as some of the communities locally. So parts of our metro, the landscape in parts of our metro contribute groundwater to over 4,000 people. And in other parts of the metro, they're contributing to smaller populations such as East Bethel or a couple hundred people. So these are areas we may want to prioritize when we're thinking about working with industries or businesses. Minnesota Technical Assistance Program is a great resource for industry to look for opportunities to reduce chemical use, manage hazardous waste, save money. There's also local hazardous waste training programs or hazardous waste disposal events that could be targeted, particularly thinking about how that can improve source water protection in certain parts of the metro. And then there's also places we may want to target grants through the Minnesota Department of Health, for example, for source water protection activities like sealing unused wells. And so I think this is very good information for everybody to keep in mind when we think about water supply protection in the metropolitan area. So I just gave you a ton of information. And for me, it gets a little overwhelming because that was just part of what's available to us. And I just wanted to share with you that when I get a little overwhelmed, I just ground myself in the fact that we all know what we should be doing. And as proof of that, I'm just going to share a little anecdote. When my son was very little, I asked him what you should do to protect water, because I'm the type of mother who gives pop quizzes to preschoolers. But he immediately said, don't make it yucky and leave some for the fish. And I thought, well, there, if my preschooler knows what we're supposed to do, we're good. We've got this. So I just always try to, before I get too overwhelmed by information, try to come back to what is it we're trying to do here. So we're good, because there's a lot of things, there's a lot of things that we can do. And so I just want to end with a couple of programs that I want to make everybody aware of. This is by no means everything we can do, but at the Met Council, we did partner with the Minnesota Technical Assistance Program in 2012 to launch a water efficiency intern program. So they do a lot of work with waste and chemicals, but we have now created a program where student interns are placed in metro area organizations to look for opportunities to reduce water use. And so they've made several recommendations that so far, as of 2018, the last time we did a big assessment, some of those recommendations were implemented and save almost 90 million gallons a year. And they are saving our local businesses almost $500,000 a year. So this is a win-win. This program is still going strong. So if you have a business, you know a business owner who might be interested, they can reach out to the Minnesota Technical Assistance Program and see if there is an opportunity to have an intern come into their business and do an audit and look for opportunities. They also have some just really great information that they could just learn from that research and apply. We also, through Clean Water Fund, I should point out a lot of our work is funded through the Clean Water Fund, have a water efficiency grant program we piloted in 2015. And this is to give grants to local communities to start their own water efficiency grant programs, rebate programs for installing low flow appliances, water efficient irrigation systems. So our pilot program saved 50 million gallons of water. And then we got ongoing funding. So we have a program now, and we're working with 40 communities. And so that has been very successful in sparking that local leadership and getting those grant programs established. And then finally, we're also doing some research with the University of Minnesota. And I included a link on this slide so you can look at it later, but we have some turf grass plots and we're testing which are the most resilient for drought. And we also have some smart irrigation controller. So we have some recommendations about how to irrigate more efficiently. We also have some engagement and outreach materials. So this is an example, the Grow Easy Peasy Lawns. We have a whole series of signs that can be customized and used in local water conservation campaigns. So that's all available online. And I just want to give a shout out to my colleague, Brian Davis, who has been the leader on a lot of this efficiency work. And he's always happy to answer questions, share information. So I just wanted everybody to be aware of that. And thank you for having me today. I'm happy to answer any more questions.
Well, thanks so much, Lanya. We do have one extra little question at the end. It's a little more on the personal side as opposed to the professional side. What do you do in your home personally to conserve water? Maybe you would pass along a tip or two to our audience today.
Well, no one would be surprised that my 12-year-old says he doesn't take as many showers to conserve water, but I love to garden. And so I have been converting my lawn, and I have a lot of sandy soils. So I've been working to convert my lawn to more of a prairie lawn and perennials. So I've been pretty excited to see this past drought, how much better my lawn did than several years ago, we had a more minor drought that kind of wiped out a lot of my plants. So I'm looking around this year to see what survived, and I'm thinking I might plant more of those just to be more resilient if we have another drought year in the future.
Thank you very much. Okay, now I'd like to welcome Paul Gardner to follow up. Paul is the administrator of the Clean Water Council. So we should visualize that he is at the hub of all the water funding and planning that goes on at the state level. And so this council recommends how to spend the clean water fund that was authorized by the Minnesota voters some years back. In addition to his work in water, Paul is also pretty well known for his expertise in recycling. So he's got his fingers in many pies, and he also did serve in the legislature. So I'd like to turn it over to Paul, and we'll just keep an eye on the questions, and I will review the chat again to make sure I don't skip any. So are we ready to rock and roll, Paul?
We are. First, let me test that my audio is working.
It sounds very good to me.
Okay, people came in from the dog walk, so I'm going to put my headphones on to avoid distractions. Good morning, everybody. My name is Paul Gardner. I'm the administrator for the Clean Water Council, and I was asked today if I could talk about how we use the Clean Water Fund and how that interacts with water conservation. Just as an aside, I wanted to mention that when I was in the legislature from 2007 to 2010, I actually authored the statute that requires municipalities to use a conservation rate structure. And after I was liberated by the voters in 2010, it was amended. There were a few cities who had their undies in a bunch, if I may say so, about the requirement. And so there was some more flexibility put in there, which were very common sense. And as Lanya described, so there it says something like, among the conservation tools you must consider our conservation rate structure. The idea was that cities should not use their water utility as a revenue generator, and they couldn't charge you less for using more or charge you the same for using more. And that has proven to be a common sense approach. Let's see. So a little bit about the Minnesota Clean Water Council. First, I thank you for the invitation, by the way. I just wanted to mention that when you run for partisan office, as I did 4 times, you are intimately aware of the League of Women Voters who run excellent candidate forums. There's never any circus like you see on TV elsewhere with town hall meetings and the like. And whenever someone holds that little card up that says you have 5 minutes or you have 30 seconds, you'd better listen. So I appreciate all the work that you do. And I know that many of you are election judges also. I just, for all the fuss that's made about election integrity, you don't hear people talking about that in Minnesota, where we have some 30,000 election judges that volunteer. My wife has done it in the last couple of years, and that's a long day, 15 or 16 hours. And people find it very helpful, and I just appreciate what you do. So let's get into the Clean Water Council. So the Clean Water Council was created in 2006 to advise on the administration and implementation of the Clean Water Legacy Act. I always like to put quotes around those bureaucratic phrases that you see in statute, just so you know, I didn't make it up. I like to use plain language whenever possible, but the Clean Water Legacy Act was created in 2006 to help fulfill some federal requirements, but also things the state wanted to do to identify what we call impaired waters, essentially polluted waters, and come up with a plan for how to clean them up. In 2006, we had divided government, so the Democrats in the Senate and the Republicans in the House did not agree on how to fund this stuff in the Clean Water Legacy Act, but they said we do need an oversight and advisory body for this that has appointees made by the governor in the constituency groups on the right-hand side there, and have advice from 6 agencies, including the Met Council, the University of Minnesota, and a couple legislators. In 2008, the Clean Water Land and Legacy Amendment was put on the ballot 2 years later, and the voters passed it quite easily. And I have no doubt that the League of Women Voters had a position on the Clean Water Land and Legacy Amendment. What it does is increase the sales tax by 0.3% for a 25-year period. The Clean Water Council was given the duty of recommending how to spend the money from that Clean Water Fund. And that's where the fund begins. So since 2008, approximately $1.4 billion has been raised for clean water. On December 31st of this year, that 25-year period will be half over. So we have been looking at the Clean Water Council strategically about what we think we can get done by 2034. There is a stipulation in the state constitutional amendment on this that sets aside money for clean water. That's one of the 3 buckets of money that the amendment supports. We have to have at least 5% of the Clean Water Fund spent to protect drinking water sources. We had never really evaluated whether we were meeting that requirement. And so when we put together funding recommendations in 2020, I worked with agencies to come up with a rough calculation, and we're at about 20% of the Clean Water Fund is being spent on protecting drinking water sources. Since groundwater and surface water are connected, I thought it would be important to show how everything is connected here. The Clean Water Fund is really trying to get after this problem, which is the impairment of our water from sometimes natural sources, which are in too high a concentration. But 85% of our state's water impairments are due to non-point sources. And these are things that in minute quantities add up to a big problem over an entire watershed. I like the jars here in the middle from the Minnesota River, just to give you an example of expectations. I think sometimes those of us who are, I call myself an environmentalist, and other environmentalists often think of things in dirty and not dirty, and that we're going to use the money to make everything perfectly clean. The right-hand jar here is from the Minnesota River when it rains. That's the sediment load that we're seeing when it rains. The jar next to that is the Minnesota River sediment concentration on a regular day. And then the far left jar that's totally clear is drinking water, quality water. The one next to the drinking water is where we want to get. This is by various proxy measurements, fishable and swimmable. It's a little cloudy, but it would be safe to fish and swim in. And you certainly could use it for drinking water if you run it through a treatment plant without any trouble. So we're trying to get to a point better or where we are. It's not going to be perfect in all places, but the big 3 that we worry about, particularly in farm country, is sediment, nitrogen, and phosphorus. In some places like in some cities like Des Moines, nitrogen is a major problem because their watershed feeding the surface water for Des Moines is entirely in farm country, whereas the Twin Cities drinking water supply for the 2 major cities is fairly diluted with water from the upper Mississippi, which is considerably cleaner. We also get bacteria from manure, waterfowl here in the metro area, and pet waste. And chloride is also a big problem, especially here in the metro, with excess application of road salt and occasionally water softeners that are not very efficient. So in government, we have a lot of lingo for how we describe things to help our conversations within government go faster. But we have found that the general public scratches their heads and says, I don't know what you're talking about. So we have taken a proactive effort to communicate what we're doing with the Clean Water Fund in plain language. So I have a couple of bullet points that I use when I talk to, say, a League of Women Voters or the Kiwanis Club or the Rotary. And here's pretty much what we do. And this applies for drinking water as well, usually. First, we test the water to figure out if there's something wrong, and then figure out the source of the problem. We come up with a plan to fix what's wrong with the water through various planning strategies. And then we do what we artfully call in government implementation to train people how to fix whatever the problem is, or persuade landowners to solve the problem on their land. In some cases, what land is set aside on things like conservation easements, or sometimes outright purchases of land where land is particularly vulnerable to erosion, let's say. And in some cases, we help restore landscapes and water to make them mimic the natural functions that existed before. So you see an example of a lakeshore restoration at the bottom center of your screen. And then we measure to figure out whether those efforts are actually working. This process can seem kind of slow. It does take years before we finally can get to the point where we can take some waters off our impaired waters list. But this process is based on science, not on politics, and therefore we're more likely to see impacts that stick. And I feel very good about that. As a former politician, I know how we can muck things up. So to have scientists guiding the work is really quite inspiring. Precipitation and aquifer data, which affect groundwater and drinking water, is critical to prioritizing which waters that we try and protect and restore. Visually, let me show you this map. This is a map of what we call the major watersheds of Minnesota, or a HUC 8, which isn't really important to remember. There are 80 major watersheds. These do not follow political boundaries like counties, which is good. And so every one of these watersheds has had some intensive monitoring. We monitor about 8 of these watersheds a year. And so over the first 10 years of the Clean Water Fund, we have figured out what's in the water. We then come up with that to-do list of everything that needs to happen in the watershed to get it to our water quality goals, to a certain concentration of a contaminant like that jar I showed you. And we call that a restoration, or a watershed restoration and protection strategy for surface water. And then there's a groundwater one, a groundwater restoration and protection strategy, or GRAPS. I heard a presentation by the University of Minnesota recently that showed how they're converting some of the 2-dimensional data from those groundwater strategies into 3-dimensional pictures. And that is actually going to be really helpful, I think, in the Metro in the future. Then local stakeholders like counties and soil and water conservation districts take all that science and that big to-do list of everything that needs to happen to hit water quality goals, and they set priorities, such as a major recreational lake, as an example, or drinking water sources as the things they ought to protect. And then we don't just leave plans on the shelf to gather dust. We actually have the Clean Water Fund to fund the science and the plans, but also the projects that do the things in the plans. This is something that other states do not have, but we do because of the Clean Water Fund. So hooray for the Minnesota Exceptionalism Industrial Complex. You can laugh at that if you want to. Just to show you the precision, I guess, of what we're doing with this information. This is just one page from one of these watershed management plans that is the summary of pages and pages of other science. It tells you how many different types of BMPs, or best management practices, we have to carry out in that watershed by a certain year in order to get a reduction in those pollutant levels. And we even have an idea of how much it's going to cost. So by 2023, we'll have these lists for every watershed in the state, and that's all paid for by the Clean Water Fund. Water managers on the ground tell us this is so much more helpful than guessing, particularly in greater Minnesota. People said, yes, we used to use the eyeball method, where we think we knew if we restored this stream that we would get an improvement in our local lake, but we weren't sure. But this gives you much more background information to know that you're likely to have success if you do these things.
So Paul, did you say that there's a chart like that for every single watershed?
There is, or will soon be.
Okay.
All of the wraps have to be completed by 2023, and we are on target to do that. And all of the comprehensive plans, which involve the prioritization, those will all be started by 2025 and finish shortly thereafter. There are 11 watersheds that just got money to do this now, so we're really accelerating progress. But this gives you, a blueprint or a to-do list. I'm a suburban, middle-aged male. I like to-do lists. I'm very linear. So this just speaks to me, Karen.
Okay, thank you.
So when it comes to drinking water, we are spending about 20% on protecting drinking water sources, and we do that in a variety of ways. We do fund a lot of the science that tells us what's going on underground in particular. And we have an alphabet soup of agencies that are actually figuring out what our groundwater is doing. And it's sometimes confusing, but our Minnesota Pollution Control Agency has wells to measure ambient groundwater quality. It's kind of a control sample of what groundwater is like at any given time in a region. The Department of Health works with cities to make sure that their public water supply well water is meeting federal drinking water standards. The Department of Agriculture, MDA, actually has tested tens of thousands of private wells in greater Minnesota, especially where there are vulnerable aquifers because of the geology, such as very sandy soil or karst geology like you have in the southeastern part of the state. So we have data on what's in the water in those 70,000 wells all over the state. The DNR is responsible for monitoring water supply. Lanya can correct me, but I'm assuming we have DNR monitoring wells all over the metro. I know we do in Ramsey County to see how the aquifer levels are doing. They also are helpful in producing groundwater atlases. So by county, you have something like you see in the right. That's a geologic atlas of Brown County. But there is a groundwater atlas to go along with that, the DNR completes. So you can kind of get an idea of where the aquifers are, and where they're moving and where they're located. Much of that work is funded by the Clean Water Fund. A picture is worth 1,000 words. This is in greater Minnesota, but it also applies in the metro. This is called a drinking water supply management area. And I don't know if my little bar here is blocking the title, but this is the city of Verndale, Minnesota, in Wadena County. This is a town that has too much nitrogen in their drinking water well. This is a particular hazard in greater Minnesota, where fertilizer and manure can contribute nitrogen levels that are too high, which can contribute to health problems, especially in infants. There are two wells in this picture. Well number 1 is at about 12 o'clock. If you looked at the picture like a clock, and the other one is well number 2, which is like at 1:30. They're right by the road. If something were to spill, like a gasoline truck or something close by in the area in red, that's an emergency response area, and you would want to stop whatever is leaking right away because it would get into the well water. There is a wellhead protection area, which shows you the direction groundwater is flowing, which is kind of from 7 o'clock to 1 o'clock on a clock here. In that area, we know that in a short period of time, stuff will get into that well if there's some contaminant on the surface in too high a concentration. But you see, the problem here is that the municipal boundary, which is the orange line for Verndale, does not encompass the entire wellhead protection area. So there are landowners on the south side of town who could put down too much nitrogen fertilizer, for example, and it gets in that blue area, and then within a year or 2 or 3 could end up in the well. But the municipality does not necessarily have the power to control what happens on that land. This is where the Clean Water Fund is very handy, because the Department of Health then uses the Clean Water Fund to delineate an area over the entire area that is a potential risk and create a DWISMA, one of the few government acronyms that flows off the tongue, a DWISMA, a drinking water supply management area. And that is the yellow and black line. And inside that funky trapezoidal shape is an area where in 10 years, any contaminant could make it inside the well, the 10-year time of travel. What we then do with that DWISMA is produce a drinking water source protection plan. And this is also done in the metro. to figure out what needs to be done to protect those 2 wells from contamination in the future. That can include working with landowners to reduce their nitrogen application. It can include using expertise from the University of Minnesota to plant perennial living cover. So instead of a perennial crop like corn and soybeans, they might have a cover crop like alfalfa or something that will grow when you have bare soil otherwise, or something called kernza. It's a plant refined by the University of Minnesota that actually it doesn't grow year round, but it stays year round, and it helps fix nitrogen and can be a cash crop. So we have a lot of tools in the toolbox, and easements are also possible. So we have multiple agencies have multiple tools that we can use to help reduce contaminants in that area. But we do have these duismas in the metro area as well. For surface water, this is especially important for Minneapolis, St. Paul, and adjoining suburbs that get water from those 2 water utilities. There are 23 surface water systems in the state. You can see where they're concentrated. So obviously we want to protect the water sources that are coming into our intakes. 25% of Minnesotans rely on that surface water. Here's an example from Mankato. It's similar to the duisma you saw for Verndale, where there is an area immediately upstream from the intakes that is an emergency response area where you're very concerned about anything that could happen there, and you have a plan for dealing with it. Then there is the blue, which is a spill management area. So you calculate the time it would take for anything spilled there to get to the intakes for Mankato. And then there's the yellow area, which is the duisma. And what we're working with cities on here is not just looking in the, say 100 acres around a well, but thousands of acres that are upstream within that watershed. And so there's a plan afoot to make sure that we have the same kind of plan here that we do for groundwater wells. This is also a rural issue, but I wanted to mention to you the logic we're applying to private wells. It could apply in the metro. We actually do have Rosemount, for example, and Hastings that are an issue. We do have nitrogen in public water supply wells around the state, and the Department of Health gets that data to the Department of Ag. The Department of Agriculture, as part of a broader statewide plan to manage fertilizer better for drinking water quality, has issued a groundwater protection rule. And so if a city has nitrogen levels that are close to being too high, it goes red in these dots here. So you see quite a few in the southwest, some in the southeast, a couple in the north central, like Verndale. If it's yellow, that means if present trends continue, it could get concentrations that are too high. Hastings, again, an example of where nitrogen levels are too high because of usually nitrogen fertilizer nearby.
Is the Hastings one, is that a municipal well?
I believe it would be. Yes.
Okay.
No, I'm sorry. I said rural private drinking water wells. That's a mistake. That's rural public drinking water wells. That's my error.
Oh, okay.
But again, what we do here is that there's a variety of voluntary efforts, some aggressive intervention by the state to work with landowners in that duisma to figure out how to get those nitrogen levels down. And the last ditch response is if nobody's responding, then some regulatory efforts can kick in. And that has not happened yet. The rule just went into effect 2 years ago. When it comes to water supply, the Clean Water Fund interacts with the Met Council on a couple of things. And Lanya alluded to them before. There is a goal by the Met Council, which is now the strategic goal of the Clean Water Council, to reduce groundwater use in the metro area by 150 million gallons a year. Lanya described 2 ways that we do that. One is doing some water efficiency work with interns at MnTap, and I think she was talking about 70 or 80 million gallons a year not needed now for groundwater because of those efforts. There are a couple of industrial technical assistance things going on, I believe, as well. But the Clean Water Fund also does support water efficiency grants for municipalities. There's a competitive grant process for that. And that can include replacing or giving people a rebate through their city to replace a toilet, dishwasher, clothes washer, but most importantly, replacing irrigation controllers. Irrigation systems outside are the biggest water hog in the Twin Cities metro residential sector. Just to give you an example, if you upgrade to a new, essentially digital system for your irrigation controller that has a soil moisture sensor, this book-sized thing that goes in the ground with probes to measure your soil moisture, which wirelessly connects to your controller and possibly a smartphone, you can make sure that you don't use the sprinkler when your lawn doesn't need it. And of course, we all hate it when we see people using their sprinkler in the rain. This wouldn't work with that new type of system. But most people water too much. With a sprinkler system, they set it to go at night for too long. And they also set it to run every other day, usually to comply with an odd even ban in their city. But it turns out you only need about an inch of water per week for a healthy lawn, and using the smart controller can help you achieve that automatically. In Woodbury, which has a lot of homes with sprinkler systems when they were built, they've calculated that the average household that has switched to those new irrigation controllers is saving 30,000 gallons a year on average. I am also a volunteer with the city of Shoreview and our watershed district as a Minnesota water steward. And I did take some training from the Met Council and the nonprofit organization called Fresh Water on how to advise residents on how to get smarter with their water use inside and out. And so I've visited about a dozen homes in Shoreview. The city will get a call from someone who's upset about their bill, and they send me out there and I talk to them about their water use. And almost all of them are using a very inefficient way of running their sprinkler system and can solve that immediately. For $150 or so, you can get an irrigation controller subsidized by the Clean Water Fund, and that thing will pay for itself in a year or two. And Lanya also described turf grass research at the University of Minnesota. They have a neat checkerboard set of test plots with these 2 or 3 foot square plots of different fescues and turf species with these little tiny sprinklers. And then they can measure how they do in the sun with too much rain, how high you cut the grass and the like. I actually have 200 square feet in my yard of fine fescue. And this year, in the worst drought in maybe 30 years, we did not only not water it, it was the greenest grass on the block. There are other ways we spend the Clean Water Fund on groundwater, and I'm getting close to the end here. We help the DNR set up groundwater management areas. This is where there's an intense focus on figuring out what can be done to maintain the quality and quantity of groundwater aquifers in areas that are under stress. There was one of these areas created for the White Bear Lake and North and East metro areas. One part of the town is dealing with PFAS contamination, and White Bear Lake has dealt with depleted water levels during dry years. It's come back, but it's under constant monitoring. In Greater Minnesota, we actually have paid for an extension educator to help farmers who irrigate a lot with those big, massive sprinkler rigs figure out how to do the same thing you would with a residential lawn, which is to essentially digitize your operation to figure out how to apply the right amount of water at the right time. If any of you are soccer fans, Allianz Field has an irrigation or a rainwater reuse system, a stormwater reuse system. So any water that falls on the stadium there goes through a drain and then into these large tanks that I think are under some lawn or parking lot. And then that is run through some filters and it's available for irrigation around the stadium. And it also provides it's not potable water, but it provides some water supply available to future businesses as they redevelop that area. Not funded by the Clean Water Fund, but very similar is a system like that at CHS Field where the St. Paul Saints play. They have a big cistern behind the center field wall that carries tens of thousands of gallons, and they use it for irrigation and cleaning up the seats. The Department of Health also uses the Clean Water Fund on contaminants of emerging concern. Many of the non-point source pollution sources I mentioned are not synthetic, they're not chemical, but we do find substances usually at small traces of amounts in our surface water, and those are sent, that information is sent to the Department of Health, and every 2 years they look at 10 different contaminants that are of great concern to come up with health-based values to figure out how much of this you can stand essentially to before it could harm human health, because the federal government does not regulate all chemicals. And finally, we do make some grants available through first the health department and now the Board of Water and Soil Resources to seal old wells, and there are thousands of them just in Ramsey County where I live. Old wells that are not in use now, which can be conduits for contaminants, particularly if you have heavy rain or flooding. They can pick up all sorts of stuff off land and buildings and deposit it directly into our aquifers. So it is a priority to seal those wells, and that often happens at land transfer. Usually costs around $1,500, and those well sealing grants give you about half that funding. I'll just leave you with Rice Creek. We call it the Clean Water Land and Legacy Amendment to think about the legacy for our kids and our grandkids. This is Rice Creek, which has been restored with Clean Water Fund support in Arden Hills and Shoreview, where the old ditch that was there for a century has now been re-meandered back into a creek, which slows the water down and helps contaminants settle out. And it's a great kayaking and canoeing resource for my family. And so that is the legacy that I hope we leave for my kids and grandkids, and they know what it is. And I don't let them forget that it was you, the taxpayer, thank you, who voted to raise your taxes during a recession to make those funds possible. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Paul, thanks very, very much. One question came up. Is there any part of the funding stream that focuses on contamination caused by spills from oil pipelines? Is that a piece of the puzzle that you work on?
It isn't. So the clean water, or excuse me, the industrial sources of pollution usually have a permit involved. So a wastewater treatment plant, for example, has to have a permit in order to pollute, essentially, to put stuff into their effluent at low enough concentrations that it's not a problem. The same goes for any factory or a big feedlot. They have to have a permit from the state. And then there are stipulations in the permit that if you violate the permit, that you're going to have to you potentially could pay a fine. You may have to pay for some repair or restitution, or there could even be criminal charges in some cases. So that's the case with Water Gremlin in White Bear Lake, where they were violating their permit. And the Line 3 construction just had a documented violation for essentially they dug too deep into a high water table. And so they were using more water than they were supposed to in their permit, and there was a violation. And I think they're going to pay a $3 million fine and pay to fix the problem that they had. So permits are binding. There is rulemaking that sets that up, and statutes. So we don't usually deal with that. The Clean Water Fund is about the science, the planning, and projects that usually are voluntary in nature. So, farming is more or less exempt from the Clean Water Act that goes back decades. We actually help support the persuasion to help people understand what they can do to make water quality better off their land. And I see my friend Dick Ottman has also asked about the pipelines no longer in use. My understanding is that under the PCA tells me that the Enbridge has to have a permit to remove the lines because they could spill something out that way. So they can't really do anything to clean it up until they have a permit. They just can't dig around willy-nilly or leave it. They just can't leave it. So that's what permits are for. And our work is to help supplement work that is not covered by law.
So really that that's the question of the effectiveness of the permitting systems, which is a whole other world then from yours.
Yeah, so I technically I am an employee of the MPCA. They had to put me somewhere in state government, and so I do work with the people who do issue the permits. And I guess the way I would put this in plain language is the permits, the how you do the permit and what's in the permit is guided by law. So there could be statutes that are more stringent about what you must do in a permit. And so that with line 3, for example, I think the interpretation is that the state agencies are doing everything they're required to in law. Some environmental advocates would say that there's more wiggle room that they could use, but that's just out, that's above my pay grade to determine
Sure.
how that's happening. But yeah, the permits are litigated too. Like environmental groups are constantly filing lawsuits against agencies to require greater scrutiny and to get permits tossed out. So there's some mining permits that have been revoked currently, and I just have to let litigation do its thing, and that isn't my area.
Another question, and maybe Lanya, she may know something about this. Is there any thought in our area about separating gray water from sewage type of water and then reusing the gray water in some fashion? Is there any initiative like that going on?
That question, thank you for asking that question, because that's come up in other conversations that I've had too. Not in my sphere have there been questions about really explicitly pursuing that. And some of the reasons that we are not looking at that in a lot of detail right now include the some of the plumbing code and some of the requirements to prevent backflow in certain connections, making sure that our potable water supply pipes are very separate and we're not going to end up getting contaminated water, not sewage, but even just what you're washing off your hands, you don't want to come back and drink. So there's some plumbing code challenges to that. So whenever we want to install a system that would separate gray water from sewage from drinking water, we have to be sure we're following the science and what we know is important for protecting public health. So that's one of the challenges that's been raised when we have those conversations. Another challenge is when we start to look at those systems and do the budget for them and look at the financing. Now you may, depending on the size of the system, be thinking about sort of 3 separate piping systems. So it's an added cost. So does it make sense to do that from an economic standpoint? This all depends on the scale of the project. I know of some people who have constructed their homes and gotten variances from the well code to do that kind of thing on an individual basis. So if somebody's interested in doing that personally in your cabin or in your house, it's not impossible, but our goal is very much, number one, protect public health. But there were some of those conversations came up in the Saints Stadium, the stormwater reuse. We're collecting water off the roof of the Metro Transit Operations Maintenance Facility in downtown St. Paul, putting it in a cistern and then using that water in the stadium. And so some of those questions came up during the design and construction of that project. So that's kind of, these trade-offs of how much will this cost, how much treatment is needed to reuse the water. So there's some good lessons learned. If anybody would like to know more about some of those conversations, I can put you in contact with, again, Brian Davis, who I work with, was the Met Council staff on that project. He'd be happy to have more information if you want to have a conversation with him about it.
What I find great about living in Minnesota, we are a water abundant state, but we tend not to wait for problems to happen to where they get like in the Southwest. And we also have statutes that make it harder for you to just suck as much water as you want out of the ground. We actually have a different way of regulating groundwater withdrawal. But you have cities like El Paso and Phoenix that are looking at groundwater recharge, where they're taking wastewater and pumping it into the ground. And I have a little heebie-jeebies about that because the wastewater treatment isn't perfect, but it's possible. But they're so short on water that they're willing to bombard it with whatever chemicals necessary to use it to drink later. One thing I like about Minnesota is that people are looking at industrial water reuse because it's a resource, not because we're desperate for water. And so there are also a lot of private companies in Minnesota that sell products and services around the world to help people get cleaner water. And I'm never quite sure why, because we're not like Arizona, where you'd think that those technologies would emerge, but we actually have a lot of private sector expertise here also.
Paul, do you remember what the statute number is, the one that you introduced that was targeted at?
I was afraid you were going to ask me that one. I want to say it's 103I something. I looked it up last night and then I forgot to write down the statute number.
Well, 103I, I mean, that's maybe a place to start,
I think that's the Groundwater Protection Act, maybe.
Okay.
But if you were to go to the legislative website under, you can Google conservation rate structure.
Okay. Somebody asked, is there any thought that in order to get homeowners to update their irrigation systems or reduce the amount of chemicals they put on their lawns, would a permit system work for homeowners, or is that not feasible?
Go ahead, Lanya.
Yeah.
I was going to say, with the Clean Water Fund support, that's one of the areas we focused with our water efficiency, the Turfgrass resource, but also our water efficiency grant program, providing incentives to do an audit of your irrigation system. And we have been focusing primarily on residences, but also I believe some businesses and city properties have participated. And then to provide incentives and rebates to, fix any damaged sprinkler heads, which makes a big difference. And we found that to be very effective. And so in terms of what seems to be an effective and not so regulatory, kind of administratively onerous approach, so far, that incentive approach seems to be working pretty well.
Go ahead, Paul.
I love the idea of trying to get people off the sprinkler system. This is just my personal opinion, but we have cities that require new housing to have an in-ground sprinkler system, and that's all wrong, in my opinion. Shoreview has done a good job at reaching out to the biggest water users, and they said, we have this guy, Paul, who can come to your house and help you figure out how to lower your bill, and we'll give you money. And still, they're not getting quite as many people bite on that as they could. So we are using a voluntary approach, and the watershed districts will give you money. The Ramsey Washington Metro Watershed District has hundreds of thousands of dollars in the bank right now to give to you to do things like rain gardens in your yard. I mean, they do not have enough projects in the pipeline. I have 2 of them in my yard, and I've taken half of my lawn out of grass into native plants. And you can get money for native plants for pollinators for a couple $100 from the state through the Lawns to Legumes program funded by the lottery. So we have a lot of tools, but there's a lot of psychology that goes along here on how to persuade people to adopt this and to see something that works. So if they see it in my yard or Lynn's yard, they say, oh, that looks nice, then maybe I should try that.
So,
but when it comes to sprinklers in a drought, man, I would love it if people just shut it down. That's just my personal opinion.
But people who are interested, they would maybe approach their watershed district as a source of information and funding, perhaps. It's a question of where do people go who are already interested?
Right. So your city website probably has some sort of water page on there, and they will have a list of partners, and that will probably tell you what your watershed district is. but it's often a watershed district. In some cases, there's a conservation district, like the Washington County Conservation District, which is very active. In other cases, there's a water management organization. So Vadnais Heights and North Oaks are part of that around Vadnais Lakes, where the city provides the funding rather than a levy. But there are people who want to give you money to help do that in the metro. And it's, if you need help finding out who that is, let me know.
Well, thank you. We need to wind up. We are approaching the end of our program, and I would like very much to thank Lanya and Paul for extremely interesting programs. And while Zoom meetings are fun, it's certainly sad when we cannot actually applaud the speakers, but give a clap if you can, but we enjoyed very much. So the question has come in, Marty. If somebody wants to watch the program, where is the access point going to be?
I'm going to send a link to you maybe this afternoon or tomorrow when I see it on my Zoom account. And then you can send it to every league president and delegate. And if anybody has their email for when they access this Zoom meeting, we can send it to them too.
Okay.
And Paul, you have your, you still have the screen. So
let me shut that sucker down.
Then we can see people giving you a round of applause, and for Lanya too.
Yes.
There we go. Let's see. I'm going to just get the gallery view so I can see everybody. Yeah.
And thanks everybody for joining us on a fine Saturday, and I hope everybody has a great afternoon. Thank you, Lanya. Thank you, Paul.
I typed in some comments about where you can find out about grants for irrigation controllers, as well as information about the turf grass and the irrigation controllers, and get some videos.
Oh, okay. But people should, I gather that people should feel free to contact Paul or contact Lanya directly to get, hooked up with another person or some of these fabulous graphics. So we thank you for that.
I put my email in there.
Okay, paul.gardner@state.mnus and Lanya.Ross at is at the Met Council website. Okay, have a great day, everybody. Thanks so much. Thank you, Marty. Thank you, League of Women Voters, Woodbury, Cottage Grove area, and Lynn Marcus. Nice to see everybody.
Thanks for the invite.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks, Lanya.